and welcome to the penultimate session in the second form of the Civic Learning for Engaged Democracy series. I'm Jackie Pfeffer Merrill, Director of the Campus Free Expression Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session for democracy's sake. How can we quicken the movement to make civic learning genuinely inclusive? I'd just like to tell our audience a little bit about the run of the show for the next hour. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are available on the forum website. And then I will moderate a conversation amongst them for the next 35 minutes or so, and then make opportunity for you to answer or ask your questions of our panelists. You can submit your questions at any time during the chat, and I will let our panelists know that I may bring them in even earlier than the 35-minute mark. So I encourage you to submit them at any point during our conversation today. Well, let me introduce our distinguished panel. To begin, we have Richard Haass, President of the Council of Foreign Relations. Mr. Haass is author of or editor of 16 books, including his most recent one, Bill of Obligations. We have Vinnakota, who is President of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Raj is also co-chair of the Task Force on Civics and Civic Engagement for the U.S. Congress's semi-quincentennial, a new word that we're all going to be needing to learn, commission as we get ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. Millie Garcia is president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. She's had many distinguished positions at the top of higher education organizations, and she came to her current position from being president of Cal State University Fullerton, the largest university in the Cal State system. And then we have last Henry Stoever, who is president of the Association of Governing Boards. Henry began his career in one of our most important civil institutions, the U.S. military. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he has served on the boards of many organizations that support our veterans and those who have been wounded in service for our nation. So welcome all four. Just delighted to have you here today. And I want to bring you all into the conversation early. But Richard, I'm going to start with you. Since you're the author of this new book, you're an expert on global affairs, but now you have written a book on civics and our obligations. So what made you write that book?
Well, first of all, thank you for not just having me, but bringing this together. It's an important subject at an important time. The reason I wrote the Bill of Obligations, and the subtitle is The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, is that even though I'm traditionally a foreign policy, national security guy, virtually every time I go out and speak about everything from China to Russia to Iran to North Korea to climate, you name it, the question invariably comes up and says, what worries you the most? What keeps you up at night? And my answer increasingly was us. And what was happening here, the divisions in our country that threatened our ability to meet our domestic challenges, the divisions in our country that made the United States anything but a model that others would want to emulate, the divisions in our country that, as we saw on January 6th and on other occasions, increasingly threaten law and order and the security and safety of our citizens. And if this continues to happen, if we're divided, we're simply not going to have the unity, we're simply not going to have the bandwidth, we're not going to have the ability to cope either with our internal challenges, much less our external challenges. So I actually think what happens here at home has now become a principal matter of national security. And my own view is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend all of our time talking about all these potential reforms, because the honest truth is they're not going to happen. So to me, the real question is, how do we create a political context, a political environment in which good ideas have a chance of being advanced?
All right. Well, thank you for that. I want to bring everybody in early. So divisions and the need to bring in good ideas. Raj, I'd like to bring in you next. What do you see as the challenge for us in our civics and civic education?
Well, Jackie, just like Richard, thank you for being here. I'm honored to be discussing this extremely important issue with this esteemed panel and all of our audience. Go back to 2019, when I first really started to dive deep into this issue. One of the things I was able to do was to spend most of that year interviewing people, practitioners, leading funders in this space, and trying to get at the core question of what is it that we're all trying to work towards. And we were able to come to a consensus view in a white paper that I released that year that said that the citizens that we were trying to develop really had to have three major sets of characteristics. One, they needed to be civically well informed, so that included understanding your civics and history, but also how to be able to discern information and be able to get information from multiple sources. You also needed to be productively engaged. That meant voting, that meant associating, mentoring, engaging in your community, and also being able to engage in civil discourse across difference towards common solution. And lastly, you needed to be hopeful and committed to American democracy. And so that included trusting your government and institutions as well as your neighbor and being hopeful about the direction of democracy. So to me, I still hold that as a North Star. It's not one single point. It's actually a very complex set of issues. But that is what we're trying to inculcate, because the democracy requires citizens that have these habits and norms that they practice all the time that I've just listed for you. And that's really why I get up every morning and work on this issue.
Right, so we had ideas in overcoming division, information, engagement, and hope. I appreciate that, adding that disposition of mind or spirit. Millie, I'd like to bring in you next. So you have worked on so many of these issues. What would you like to add to what Raj and Richard have already said about the challenges that we face?
First of all, I want to say thank you as well. What a distinguished panel, and thank you, audience, for listening to such an important topic. But let me talk about higher education and education in general. You know, very early on when the civic learning system began, it was very homogeneous. And what we need to do is make sure that we understand the changing demographics of the country. And how do we educate everyone to be an engaged citizen in democracy? We are a nation of immigrants. How do we bring our new immigrants coming into our country and educate them about democracy in the United States and be hopeful of what this country has done? And so we need to really look at the programs we do on our campuses, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. We at ASCU have the American Democracy Project, over 20 years old, working with campuses to ensure that civic learning and understanding democracy and also having civic dialogue with respect is taught at our campuses, and be able to agree to disagree and have those debates, go back to debating. So for us, it's about education, educating all citizens, no matter where you live, where you come from, in order to engage in society as a democratic, engaged citizen that's going to go out and have amazing careers and be leaders in our communities.
Well, I know we'll want to hear more about the American Democracy Project, and I appreciate, in particular, the point about respectful debate. I mean, we're at a time where the students who are on our campuses see politicians and celebrities rewarded for very uncivil engagement on social media. So that seems to be, part of the challenge. So Henry, I want to bring you in now. So American Democracy in Jeopardy, paper of yours from late last year. Obviously, you see that there's a challenge and we're in jeopardy. What would you like to add to what we've said so far about the challenges that we face in civics education?
Jackie, just like my fellow panelists have said, thank you so much for including us and me in this important discussion. The reason I wrote that paper about 6 months ago, and for our audience, that paper and a video can be downloaded at www.agb.org/democracy. Pretty simple, agb.org/democracy. 3 reasons I wrote it. Number one, I didn't make up this term. Thomas Jefferson made up the term. The future of our democracy is dependent upon an educated citizenry. So that's the cornerstone of the kind of the foundation of my thinking. Number two, in my current role at AGB, many people think of board members as boards, rather, and their members as guardians of the futures of their institutions. And if you take that at an aggregate level, they in turn are guardians of our future of our country. and of our countries around the world, not just in the United States. And number three, back to the article that you asked me about, there's kind of three reasons I wrote it. Number one, we've all seen what I call the weaponization of education, or politicization, that's a tough word to say, of higher education in many states across the country. And so that's the first reason I wanted to call our board members' attention to really ensuring that board members are there to listen and act independently, listen independently, think independently, but act collectively as a board. Number two is, and I think Richard and Raj mentioned this, around civil discourse. I too believe that the future of our country is dependent upon not only creative thinking, analyzing ideas and concepts, but the ability to engage in civil discourse, regardless of what one's perspective might be. And the background of that perspective is based on a publication that AGB wrote about 2 years ago. As an AGB Board of Directors statement on justice, equity, and inclusion, and a project that we launched about 3 years ago, which was the AGB Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative. And the basis for that is, I believe that everybody should afford others the opportunity to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, clearly, if you afford somebody that and they don't reciprocate, that can lead to a different discussion and different decisions. But that's the second one, is around civil discourse. And the third one is around how boards can develop, or the importance of boards developing and deploying an equity strategy across and into their policies, programs, and priorities, so that that equity lens can be infused across the campus, and also, number three, included with their communities. And you all know that campuses can be very large communities, whether it's multi-campus systems or multi-city institutions. So that's really kind of a summary, Jackie, of why I wrote the article, what inspired me. And as you mentioned, 35 years ago, I spent time in the military and serving our country. So our country is very important to me. And what I've tried to do is infuse the importance of our country and civil education into the thinking of boards and their strategic priorities.
Well, I appreciate your pointing to boards. I mean, one thing that we're really looking for in this conversation today is very practical takeaways for the audience, and the need to engage all the different members of the campus community. And I know, Henry, that you and your colleagues wrote top strategic challenges for boards, and one of those 5 on that list concerns civics and civic education. So I want to come back to real specifics about how boards get that done in a bit. But I want to turn back to this question of college presidents as well. I'm going to come to both Millie and Raj on this. And Raj, perhaps I'll start with you. I know Citizens and Scholars has brought together a coalition of college presidents to focus on some of these issues. What are the presidents aiming to do? What's top of mind for college presidents as they try to tackle this issue?
One of the motivating factors for college presidents is that they themselves, this group of now 15 to 20 presidents, recognized that over the last few decades that universities and colleges had kind of lost the sight around the fact that they needed to focus on citizen development and civic preparedness as much as they needed to focus on ensuring that their students went out and got a job. That there's this real delicate balance between institutions needing to be a private good, right? You go, you pay tuition, you get a degree, you want to get some return on that degree, and institutions also being a public good, and the need to be able to educate their students to be good citizens of the country and of the globe. And that all of the pressures were really focused around this private good notion of these institutions, and that we needed to get balance back. Yet at the same time, presidents felt that whenever they were taking steps that might be seen as difficult, that really there was incoming coming from everywhere: students, faculty, administrators, boards, donors, alumni, policymakers. And so they felt the need to be able to engage with each other around this specific issue with other presidents who felt the same way, who may come from very different types of institutions, but we're all trying to move forward on this issue. I would add just myself that looking at college presidents, since they have such a significant role of being the culture setters for the institutions and being really at the fulcrum of so many different conversations that are going on inside their campuses and in the larger community, that getting them to really take leadership roles and being able to stand strong and withstand a lot of this buffeting could prove a powerful way towards moving towards, as you, Jackie, have asked, a more inclusive way of actually ensuring civic learning is happening on all of our campuses.
Well, Millie, you were one of those as a multi-time college president who was buffeted about, I'm sure, and I appreciated your remarks early about having to meet all the needs of the different kinds of students who come to our college campuses, and campuses are sometimes the most diverse community in which students will ever find themselves at any point in their lives. So, as a college president, how do you focus on making that mission central and getting the kind of buy-in from across your campus communities?
I want to add to Raj's comments because I think they were right on point. And it's also working with the boards and somehow educating the boards of who are the new students and who are the new people who are in your communities in the areas in which you serve. That's number one. Number two, the president has to be framing the discussion on making civic learning engaged in the strategic plan so that they are leading the discussion and role modeling across the campus. Number three is role modeling, going out and making sure that they have the presidential lecturer, and having opposing views and showing how to go about and role modeling the behavior and working with the communities as well. And then you have to work with the administrators to get them to know, where do your students come from? What is in your community? Who are the individuals? And how do you engage in civic engagement and civic learning? Those things are extremely important. And the last thing I will say is, we had asked you who are doing professional development programs, and in the center of every professional development program is the understanding of civic learning, because presidents are concerned and sometimes are afraid to say, I don't know how to deal with all the backlash that I'm getting. So having a community of professional development from emerging leaders all the way to becoming a president, to learn how to deal with what's in front of us, how to be role models, and how to be equity-centered leaders.
I think the role models piece is really key, since we don't see enough role models, and the notion of a college president himself or herself being on stage with speakers who represent, or maybe paired speakers who represent a different point of view. I want to come back to some of that, and to hear a little bit more about the kinds of professional development that you mentioned, not only for presidents, but in your experience as president, how you develop faculty on your campus, how you develop student affairs leaders on your campus. So I know today we have tuning in lots of different sorts of people who are involved in these topics in college campuses. It is not just presidents and trustees, but many of those who have other roles in the campus community. Richard, I want to come back to you. So your Bill of Obligations, number 9, was Teach Civics. Can you tell us a little bit more? It's hard to know what exactly we mean sometimes by teaching civics. What do you mean by that?
Give me about 30 seconds to get to that. And I think, by the way, civics should be taught in middle school, high school, as well in 2 and 4 year colleges. Excuse me. I think university presidents can do a lot. They have discretion, things like first year experiences. They can create special moments early on in the school year, early on when someone comes to college, to offer, say, a set of readings, and then it becomes something that everyone has to talk about. They can also have rules on the college, things like civility, nonviolence. These ought not to be just rules. Sorry, for when people leave campus, but also for how they conduct themselves on campuses. I think it's important that colleges become classically liberal, becomes safe spaces in the original sense of the word, where you can have real disagreement and real intellectual honesty. When it comes to the content of the course, that's obviously complicated. Someone, I think, already has pointed out, Raja might have been, about how education, the content's gotten politicized or even weaponized at times. But I think it comes out to American democracy. There are classic texts, everything from the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, various Supreme Court decisions. In the course of writing my book, I read, the inaugural addresses, farewell addresses. We have an incredibly rich textual history. There's also a lot of visual things, speeches to hear, and so forth. I think people have to be exposed to that. They've got to be exposed to the basic factual history. I think also they need to be exposed to various interpretations of the history. There's not one correct set of analyses or interpretations. There are competing ones. I think there's a role here for debates where people are exposed to various approaches and also then have the chance to get informed, to get involved, to be civil, think about things like compromise. And I also think we have to talk about the behaviors and attitudes that make a democracy work. And you've heard a lot of them from my colleagues here today, things like civility, about being informed, and Moynihan's old quote that we're all entitled to our own opinions, just not to our own set of facts. So I think it's important then when we teach democracy, we not only teach the facts, we not only teach the text, but we talk a little bit about the cultural things, about the importance of norms. What is a norm, and why are norms so important in an American democracy? I actually think there's a lot to choose from, and it can be done in a way that doesn't try to impose a single or simple view of our narrative. Let me just say, our narrative is key. This is a country that was founded on ideas. It was founded on the idea of Americanness. It's not a hereditary system. And even if we haven't always lived up to our values, it is based on certain values of equality and opportunity. And I think younger people need to be exposed to that, to value democracy, because all the polls suggest they don't. And that ought to give us all grounds for concern. I think we have to make the case for democracy, even if our government doesn't always live up to its potential.
Well, I may want to follow up on this question of the polls, but and whether or not we see kind of declining support for those institutions, because we do see that young people strongly support in the Gallup survey. Strong support for freedom of expression, both on campuses and off campuses. But I want to come to what seemed like one of your key recommendations, that there be a required course for civics in higher education.
100%. Virtually every college and university offers these courses. Virtually none, very small percentage require them. Mm-hmm. And I think it ought to be required. I think along with information literacy, how to be a critical consumer of information, obviously critical thinking, we want people to be comfortable with computers and math and reading. I think this is no less important. So yes, I think it ought to be required. I believe that universities need to stand for something. And the idea of preparing Americans for living in a democratic society, what could be more important? What could be more important than doing that? So yes, I think it ought to be required. And as I said, I love the idea of common courses, because it also then gives students who are otherwise so often siloed in their departments, it gives them something to talk about. It gives them something that they've all been through. So yeah, I think whether it's one semester or, Stanford, for example, by next year, every single Stanford freshmen, 1,700 of them next year, will be required to take the module last one quarter on civics. And that's how they're going to spend part of their winter quarter. And I think that's an important statement of one of the finest universities in the world, to say this is part of our mission. And quite honestly, I hope it's something that other universities emulate.
Yeah, in fact, for those of you who are able to tune in yesterday or later will be able to watch these the recorded forums, there's a whole panel conversation yesterday with Roosevelt Montas and others about whether or not there should be a required civics class and how that one might go about implementing that. Millie, I want to come back to you. So I know that for a higher education institution to introduce any thorough curricular change it takes a lot of work to implement something like that. And I know working with your member institutions, are they discussing a required civics class? And for those that aren't, what's the alternative to meeting this need for civics education?
Jackie, as you know, we bring together our provost and our presidents with the academic affairs meeting where we actually talk about civic learning and how to do that. And I agree with Richard, it should be a required course, but it should not only be one course. It should really be embedded throughout the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And what you need to do is have a provost and a team of deans, et cetera, understanding. And I think now is the right time to move this issue. We are at a time that there is a crisis and our campuses are feeling it. If there's any place they're feeling it is on campuses. And so how do we take this moment to begin the movement to start talking with faculty, especially the core programs, especially first year experience, especially everything that you do in orientation when you're bringing students in, to ensure that you start to have these conversations and get it through a process. You know, it is a process. It is a process that goes from the faculty into the administrators, but this is the prime time to actually do this. And so at our conferences, every conference we have, since I've been president, it's now 5 years almost, we now begin to have a discussion of democracy, civic learning, and we make sure we bring in people from different perspectives on stage at the same time to have the conversation. And then this way, the individuals can go back and have discussions among themselves. And as you know, every campus is different. The cultures are different. Take that information back and adapt it to your process. Stanford is very different from Fullerton, but you adapt the process in your context.
Well, I appreciate that both Richard and you, Millie, have mentioned the first year experience and first year orientation. I just want to add, we have our own report at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Campus Free Expression and New Roadmap. And one of the core recommendations of that in the task force was, don't miss that opportunity when students are arriving on campus. There's a lot of pieces to their, finding where's the gym, who's my roommate, and what are they like. But that's a critical moment, along with the entire first year experience, to be building those skills, developing the hope that Raj mentioned, and building the capacity to be a genuine listener, even to people with whom you're going to disagree, and having the courage to be the only one in the room who is willing to make a certain case that you as a student really believe in.
Jackie, if I can.
Yes.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Yes.
The first year experience is wonderful, but I just spoke to students in California last week in little focus groups. And what they said to me was, when you do it just once, there's so much information thrown at me, I forget it. So that's why I said we have to continue to talk about this, because they're all brand new. If they're first generation low income students of color, this is an experience that no one in their family has had, and they're nervous.
Mm-hmm.
So I put that on the table, that it has to be more than that.
Sure, I wholly endorse that, and I bet everybody else would too. I want to bring in Raj and Henry back in on something that Richard mentioned about having something that we all share together, important foundational texts and core texts, and developing a sense of shared American history. We all know that today is so contested, and coming up with a notion of shared, what are the important foundational documents? What's our narrative? And I want to hear from both of you, Raj and Henry, on this. And Henry, perhaps I'll start with you. So when you're with the boards, when you say, civics is priority number 3 of strategic priorities, do you take that up on council your boards of trustees who are members, take that up in the curriculum committee? How do you actually operationalize that?
Yeah, great question. And it's easier to ask than to answer, and certainly easier to answer than actually do. I think it's important to start with some context here. When I think about context, boards in the aggregate, not the people, but the board in the aggregate is accountable for everything that happens or fails to happen on a campus with regards to their strategic priorities that boards develop in collaboration with their president. And while boards are accountable, they delegate the operational responsibility to the president. I just want to, maybe that's a standard known, but I just want to make sure that the audience knows that I'm not encouraging activist board members. And we at AGB certainly don't think that boards should be running the campus. That's Millie and her former colleagues' job, no doubt about it. But accountability is important to start with. And so as boards talk about accountability, the first thing they have to do is establish their strategic priorities. Now, when I think about priorities, those are, some people use the term outcomes. What are the outcomes that we anticipate for our college or university, whether it's a 2-year, 4-year, or a graduate program? The second part that's around accountability and outcomes. The second part, from a context perspective, is realizing that most board members have never worked a day in their life on a campus. So I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a fact. Okay. As opposed to corporate boards, where I spent 10 years prior to AGB working with corporate boards, most corporate board members have come from industry. And they bring that relevant industry experience into the boardroom. And so right out of the gate, board members are behind the 8 ball because they don't know about the key characteristics of higher education around academic freedom, tenure, shared governance. You talked about sharing. You didn't use the word or the phrase shared governance. And so all 3 of those key characteristics are really important to know, to understand, and to be able to operationalize with the president so that you're not coming into conflict, you're working in concert with your president. And so at the end of the day, when we wrote that biennial publication, Top Strategic Issues Facing Higher Education, I actually think that we shouldn't number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because it makes one think, okay, 3 is not as important as 2, et cetera, et cetera. There are 5 key priorities. The first one we wrote was equitable student success. At the end of the day, I encourage all boards and their members to prioritize equitable student success. If you admit somebody, you should exhaust all reasonable efforts to get that person through in a reasonable time with practically no debt. Because at the end of the day, not finishing with debt is the worst outcome we can imagine. So equitable student success was number 1. Number 2 we wrote was sustainability of the enterprise. And so when you think about, we want to get students through the program, we need to retain them, graduate them, and hopefully they can live a life that's better than what they started and is aligned with their expectations. The institution needs to be around for a long time as well, not only for the campus, but the community. Because many of these colleges are in small towns, as you know. And so we need to maintain sustainability of the enterprise. And that's the third part, was if we can take care of the students, maintain sustainability of the enterprise, we need to make sure that the boards prioritize civic learning in collaboration with the president. So by all means, we do not say, like picking up Richard's point, this class should be taught. That's not a board priority. The board should say, how do we prioritize civic learning? President, you and your provost, your faculty, you figure it out. We're going to establish priorities, whether it's first year experience, whether we're going to weave the themes throughout all curricula, et cetera. So we make sure that it becomes a priority. That's our aspiration, Jackie.
Well,
Civic learning becomes a priority. And just to finish out the five, since I'm on the five, number 4 was around risk and overseeing risk, and number 5 was around ongoing learning, creating an ongoing learning journey for board members. Because whether you're day 1 or decade number 2, because some boards, as you know, have board members that have been along for many, many tenures or many, many presidents. Boards always have a lot of learning. Board members have a lot of learning to do. So at the end of the day, we need to prioritize that. So hopefully that answers your question, Jackie, that we're not encouraging boards to say how to implement, but it's in order, our aspiration is that boards establish in collaboration with the president strategic priorities that do include civic learning and engagement.
Well, I appreciate that, and it was perhaps on me to say it was 3 out of the 5, number 3 on that list. I didn't mean to say that they were. It's like when you go to a grocery store, you put cheese, milk, eggs, butter, and oranges on the list. They're all important. All 5 items. So, and I appreciate, as a former faculty member myself, I appreciate the emphasis on shared governance and all the members of the campus communities that have a part of that. I want to bring Raj in on this question, though, of like, how is it that we agree? Like, we all say we want to have civic learning and a shared understanding. But it is so hard at this fraught moment that Richard pointed us to in his remarks at the very top of our conversation today to agree on what is it that we share, about what are we hopeful, what are the texts or ideas or the narrative that we want to think of as a shared experience for college students. So I want to also remind our audience members, this panel is ready for your questions. So please add them in the chat. And Raj, tell us, how do we figure out today, when it is so fraught, what is it that is at the core of that shared civics learning and hopefulness?
So I'll take an audience question instead, Jackie. No, just joking. I actually want to give you 3 quick answers, and I'm not begging the question. The first is, I do want to triple down on this concept of civic skills. I mean, Richard, Millie, and Henry got to it in different ways, because you don't have to take a wholesale redoing of the curriculum in order to start to infuse many of these things, right? A lot of the things we're talking about are practices, habits, norms, skills building, and a faculty member in the molecular biology department can be infusing that into how they teach their course as much as your poli-sci or a history professor and so on. And so there's ways of getting at this, especially the skills and the practices and the habits, that you can do much more quickly than having to really go through those processes, which I realize are really encumbering and fraught. The second is, I do want to just touch for a moment on the shared text issue. So Richard talked about Stanford. One of the things that they did in their response was they gave a lot of latitude for how professors were teaching the courses, but they actually narrowed the text that they wanted everyone to read. And one of the reasons that they did that is because they wanted all of their freshmen to be able to have the ability to talk to anyone who was in their class, right? Kind of in the dorm room or at lunch or so on and so forth, saying, yeah, I read that book and here's how I thought of it, right? So part of the reason that we talked about a shared text is because we want to be able to generate the kinds of conversations that happen not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. And I think it's really important to do that. And now similarly, even outside of school, you need to have some shared text so that you have a shared view of what this country is about. So things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation. And, when I was still working at the Aspen Institute in 2018, I read and looked at over 50 different presidential speeches. Richard, a little bit to what you were doing, I guess, as well, and trying to pull themes and figure out what are 8 or 10 of these that really speak to some commonalities and wanting to have everyone read them. So I think you can pull that, but you can decide which speeches you want to pull as long as there's at least some shared understanding of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Lastly, Jackie, I'm actually going to try to answer your question. So I apologize for taking this long to wind it up. The answer generally is I don't know. But the way in which we at CNS or Citizens and Scholars are thinking about this is to say, maybe we need to allow multiple pathways. But the things that we need to get precise around is what are the things that we're actually going to measure? And in order to do that, we've started to spend some time. Are you still there?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just kind of, we started to spend some time around what is the measurement framework we would use to even start to understand what does it mean to be civically prepared. And so next week, we'll be coming out with a major report that we've been working with more than 40 institutions that starts to create a framework around how we go about attempting to measure and understand the tools that are out there to measure civic preparedness. That's step one, but somewhere along that road, we will start to talk about different content that helps you get there more easily.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your mentioning this question of measurement.
Yeah, Jackie, can I jump in on
yes,
Raj's comment? So at AGB, we have many what we call advisory councils of board chairs and committee chairs and presidents and board professionals. But we also have a council that focuses on equitable student success. And in our first meeting of that council a couple of years ago, we talked about 4 key requirements that we want to develop. The first one is, how do we define equitable student success? And to Raj's great point, well, if we define it like this in words qualitatively, how do we measure it quantitatively? The third part that I wanted to, so those two I agree with. What's more important, I think, or just as important to Raj's point, is asking the question, well, who's responsible for that activity or those activities? And number 4, do sufficient resources exist in the budget so that, number 3, who's responsible can deliver the metrics that are aligned with the qualitative outcomes? So it's one thing, Raj, if you can define it and measure it, but at the end of the day, if we go to, President Garcia back in her day and say, here's the metrics, but she said, you know what? I don't have the money. I don't have the resources. I don't have the capacity to actually deliver those metrics, Raj, that you have created with the systems. It's I don't want to say it's worthless, but you need to have the 4 working in tandem with one another: the definition, the metrics, the people, and with the capacity and the resources.
Yep. And I want to ask, I want to highlight again and pick up on Raj's pointing to this question of metrics. I mean, the question of our panel is, how is it that we could quicken the movement to make civics learning genuinely inclusive? And how do, campuses have become very diverse. Being very diverse is not necessarily the same as being very inclusive. Millie, I'd like to just kind of bring you in on this, and then we'll come to our first audience question. When you think of really measuring how well, and I imagine it's really hard task, how is it that you really know you have been genuinely inclusive in creating a respectful learning environment for everybody on your campus, including on these civics questions?
I think once you get to the definitions, it is extremely important that we listen to the people on campus, including students. What we forget is how to get feedback from our students in multiple ways, so that you're not only getting the students that are deeply engaged because they don't have to work, which is a very small percentage of our students in our institution, but that you could do focus groups in the classroom. And I 100% agree with Raj. It could be done throughout the curriculum and outside of the classroom. There are so many centers. There are areas for adults where we pay attention just to adults, and finding ways to have surveys, focus groups, and also use questionnaires and bring all that data together. Students have a way of being very honest. And so it is extremely important that you get as much input from students as well as from faculty and staff. They are these wonderful measures across the country where you start to measure how people feel working on your campus, what are they feeling, and how do you address that? And it is up to the administration to make sure that you're doing this periodically. And then also go back and give that information to the campus, and let them know what we're doing together and hoping to continue to make it an inclusive campus.
Yeah.
Can I
And
just raise a caution
Yeah.
here? Two things. One is the idea that this is done everywhere. It's a little bit like responsibility. If everyone has responsibility for something, nobody has responsibility for anything. So part of my concern is, yes, it ought to be distributed throughout the curriculum. One should be civil in a biology class as well as in an English literature class. I understand that, but I still think there is a place for required exposure to civics. And there's certain things, again, certain texts, certain histories, which are American democracy specific. And that can't be done, if you will, if it's generalized. I think there really has to be uh, a limited degree, if you will, of this can be done everywhere. I actually think there is a case for a required course with certain required text. There can be a bit of variation on top of a core, if you will, but there really does need to be a core. There can't be 20 different ways of meeting a civics requirement. I actually think there has to be one core way, and maybe there can be additional ways on top of that. I think that's important. The other is, I think we're not just preparing students for life after campus in our democracy. We want them to practice it while they're on campus. And one of the things universities can do is make clear what the expectations are. And a lot of universities have had trouble with free speech. A lot of universities have had trouble with, if you will, creating civil environments. And I think universities have to be clear. This is what is expected. And that to me has to be part of this.
Richard, for me, it's both and. It's not either or. You could have the course, but I really believe that doing just one course is not enough.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think there could be more. No, I just think there needs to be the foundational core course. If there's more than that and it goes out over the 4 years, fantastic. I actually think your point is important. You just can't front load it all in a first year experience, couple of weeks. It's gotta be continued through the experience. I think is a good insight.
I want to pick up on and kind of amplify one of the questions that or points that Richard has just made. So, Pew found that only half of Americans agree that colleges and universities are having a positive effect on the way things are going in this country, and which is a worrying statistic for all of us who are deeply concerned about higher education. And one of the components of that, there's concerns about costs, concerns about employment prospects. But one of the concerns, and I believe it was 79% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents, but also 17% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents felt that classrooms were not always spaces for that faculty members made for viewpoint diversity. Now, we know when we ask students about, do your professors make space on college campuses for viewpoints across the political spectrum? When the UNC survey that was conducted by Mark O'Malley and O'Neilly and others on campus this year, students found that they did say that with very few exceptions, faculty treated viewpoints from across the political spectrum equally in the classroom. But thinking about this public perception that campuses are not always true homes to open inquiry, are there things that campus leaders, whether it's presidents, trustees, faculty, can do to counter this perception? And is the perception really accurate that campuses and classrooms are not places that are open to viewpoint diversity and freedom of expression?
Well, I'm going to jump in here. You didn't ask for priorities, but I'm a big believer in tone at the top, and the tone needs to start with the board and the president. And so that has to be a very tight partnership, because if it's, I'm going to split my fingers, if it's the board thinks this and the president thinks that, that is corrosive, as opposed to collaborative and accretive to the outcomes. So I think it has to be a kind of a tone at the top, Jackie. The other part that I think about is how boards can engage with multiple constituencies around the campus and the community. Because if they're not listening, I mentioned shared governance. Raj talked about some other things. But to me, shared governance is a really essential characteristic of higher education. And even though board members may not understand it, they may not agree with it, they need to embrace it, because the future of higher education, the future of strategy, so to speak, it needs to be well informed through shared governance, through listening and understanding. I'm not saying you have to agree with everybody, but at least understand different viewpoints so that they can share, you can share. But to me, it starts with the tone at the top, in partnership between the board and the president.
Could I just also add, I think those are right on, Henry, but I also think we have to be more diligent in getting the stories out of what's happening on our campuses. I was in Orange County, and I had a lot of diverse voices on my campus. And we always got the complaint, and yet here I am bringing in people from both sides of the spectrum. And sometimes we need to get the help from the media, because they just highlight what happened, the bad thing that happened. And every day, these faculty members are really trying to give both sides of the issue. And so I think, yes, I think we need to do a better job. Yes, I think we need to be role models, as I said earlier, work with the board, have our administrators working, make sure that, as Head Richard said, we have norms. But sometimes I think we get a bad rap because something terrible happened on this side of the campus, and they don't see what the whole picture is. And the public is seeing that. It's just like cost.
I think
our
that
cost is nothing like what it is in some of these institutions. And so our cost was $6,000, and everybody thinks it's too expensive. It may be a lot, but it's not horrific.
Millie, I think that question about getting the story out about what's happening on campuses really connects to the question that has come in from Brian Murphy. With all the talk about shared values and civic purposes, how did the panelists respond and have advice regarding how we can better respond to the legislative political intervention into the curriculum with attacks on critical race theory, DEI, and even the use of intersectionality as an analytical tool? Thanks, Brian Murphy, for that question. So these legislative moves are maybe a response to the perceptions that campuses aren't true homes to open inquiry. So how would those of you who have campus roles or working with presidents or trustees think about this question about legislative intervention in campus governance?
All right, since nobody jumped on this one, I'll jump on it. We get asked quite a bit. So what are you going to do about it? Okay, Henry, what are you going to do about it to kind of quell all this stuff? Well, I go back to the article that I mentioned at the beginning, the democracy article that you held up, Jackie. In one of the first, I think the second page, I personally stated that I believe that anyone in a governance role, whether that's the president of the United States, Congress, governors, state legislatures, and governing boards, should stay at a strategic level and establish strategic priorities and work with those who are in the operational roles to develop the prioritized outcomes, and let them, the operators, figure out how we need to deliver the strategic priorities. So I personally do not think it's appropriate on what we're talking about here. But at the end of the day, it's all about politics, in my view. I have two board members on the AGB board that have been appointed, that are appointed by the state of Florida governor, the former, not the current governor. And we talk about this quite a bit. And at the end of the day, are you going to change a politician's view who is doing something in order to enrage their base, to strengthen their base? Or are you going to put at risk the future of your institution? So we believe that the board should be the buffer between the political entities and the operators, and that the operators, meaning the president on down, should not engage in that political engagement. Because at the end of the day, if you use social media, et cetera, to kind of engage on the political banter, it's going to be nowhere but downhill. And so it's unfortunate, no doubt about it. I think we need to stay true to the course and allow our appointed board members to engage with the politicians who put them there in the first place. But it shouldn't be the campuses working out of or not in coordination with their board, because that's going to be nothing but problems.
Agreed. I also think we're having a institute here, Equitable Student Success Institute, and a couple of presidents came and spoke about this very issue. The other thing is, when you're the president and you're working with the board, use influential people, use businesses that understand why it's important for us to be a diverse community, engaged in learning from each other and becoming engaged citizens in their community. Business leaders get this, powerful donors get this. You have to partner with those within your community to try to talk to individuals about why this is important. And a president can't do it by themselves. Maybe the board can, and the board has to engage those powerful people.
Can I give a slightly different answer at the risk of being the skunk at the garden party? I think that those responsible for courses, particularly if they're required courses, need to look hard at the content and listen to what the critics say, maybe reject everything they say on the merits, fair enough, but I'd first hear it out, I'd look carefully, and then I'd push back and where you think it's warranted. And you got to fight for what you believe in. I realize, public universities that are publicly funded and have publicly appointed individuals, it's a different political environment. But at the end of the day, I'd hear the criticisms, I'd look at what you're doing, and some of the criticisms might be fair, some are not. Take the fair ones, reject the bad ones, and go fight for what you believe in and be prepared to take the consequences. That I don't know any other way to conduct oneself in a political environment. And you get political allies where you can. If you're going to be, in a sense, attacked politically, then you have to defend yourself. But make sure you're comfortable with what you're defending. And I don't think in the word diversity, there also has to be legitimacy, quality, authoritativeness, and so forth. It can't be everything and anything goes. I think universities have to look really hard at what they're teaching, particularly if it's required.
Raj, I want to give you a chance to jump in here in just 1 minute, because I know we need to be moving on to the final session today. But how do the presidents that you are working with in the coalition think about kind of not necessarily acting politically in the sense of engaging lawmakers and the governor directly, but in kind of thinking about this question of public trust and confidence on this, counting the perception that universities aren't home to open inquiry when, we know that there's another story to be told about what's happening on campus?
Well, I would just first of all echo everything that Richard, Millie, and Henry just said. And part of the frustration, I think, on the part of certain members of our consortium are exactly what Millie said, which is there's a lot of good going on, and yet the narrative focuses on those situations that speak against it. I think to Richard's point, they are trying to figure out what's the right avenue, because you don't necessarily have to take every issue head on, right? Sometimes the advocacy and the work is done quietly to be able to convince folks of what you're trying to do. Other times you need to do it publicly. But right now, frankly, higher education is in a bit of a defensive crouch. And so it's really hard to come out of that, and trying to figure out when's the right moment and what are ways in which it's not just one institution as opposed to a set of institutions, or, sometimes private colleges and universities have a lot more cover than public institutions. So when are the privates coming to support the publics, right? And I'm not suggesting there's an easy answer, but those are the kinds of conversations that we're engaging in.
Well, I think that's the perfect note on which to end this conversation, because it comes back to the same virtue that you pointed us to, Raj, in your first comments, the question of hope and coming together. And amongst the whole forum over the last yesterday and today, the last 2 days, we really brought together a whole diversity of organizations in this space that are working together. And I think, ways in which we can all work together will respond to these common challenges. So I want to say thank you to everybody for tuning in for this session. And I want to say especially thank you to the Civic Learning for Engaged Democracies Forum's sponsors today, the University of Virginia Karsh Institute of Democracy, and all the organizations in the Civic Learning for Democratic Engagement Coalition, the American Associations of Colleges and Universities, Campus Compact, College Promise, Complete College America, and the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. I want to ask all of you who are tuned in to stay in for another 15 minutes for our final session today. You'll have a chance to hear from Rob Anderson, who is president of the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and he will be telling you about the next forum planned in this series, as well as with some colleagues, other opportunities that may be of keen interest to those who are tuning in for institutes and sessions upcoming this summer. So thanks all four of our panelists, Richard Haass, Millie Garcia, Henry Stoever, Vinnakota. Thanks to our host and thanks to our audience.
Thank you all.